Is God real? Are the stories in the Bible true? I need answers.
Welcome to A Closer Look with the Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church. I'm Fred Jeff Smith, pastor of Shiloh, and I'm very happy that you chose to spend the next hour with us as we delve into the study of God's Word. We can't do what we don't know. Here at Shiloh, we want to spend time studying the Word so that we can rightly apply the Word to our daily living and make a difference in our community and in our world for Jesus Christ. Won't you join us now for a closer look into God's Word? We are continuing our look at Hebrews, and today we hope to cover, at least in portion, that part of Hebrews that I think is best known to most of us, Hebrews chapter 11. If you don't know anything else about Hebrews, if you've been coming to Sunday school for a little while, you know Hebrews 11 and 1, at least from the King James Version. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Well, help us to put that in context by spending a little time with us going back to what we were talking about on last week. Last week we lifted up the whole idea of faith. That's what the writer lifted up, but he did so from the standpoint of perseverance. And really, as you continue into chapter 11, perseverance is the theme of faith as well. So, turn back with me, before we get to Hebrews 11 and 1, turn back with me to Hebrews chapter 10, and let us start reading with verse 19. It's lengthy, but I think it's important for us to look at it in the context of what it is that we are talking about. So, friends, we can now, without hesitation, walk right up to God, into the holy place. Jesus has cleared the way by the blood of his sacrifice, acting as our priest before God. The curtain into God's presence is his body. So let's do it full of belief, confident that we're presentable inside and out. Let's keep a firm grip on the promises that keep us going. He always keeps his word. Let's see how inventive we can be in encouraging love and helping out, not avoiding worshiping together as some do, but spurring each other on, especially as we see the big day approaching. If we give up and turn our backs on all we've learned, all we've been given, all the truth we now know, we repudiate Christ's sacrifice and are left on our own to face the judgment. And a mighty fierce judgment it will be. If the penalty for breaking the law of Moses is physical death, what do you think will happen if you turn on God's Son, spit on the sacrifice that made you whole, and insult this most gracious Spirit? This is no light matter. God has warned us that he'll hold us to account and make us pay. He was quite explicit. Vengeance is mine, and I won't overlook a thing, and God will judge his people. Nobody's getting by with anything, believe me. Remember those early days after you first saw the light. Those were the hard times, kicked around in public, targets of every kind of abuse. Some days it was just you, other days your friends. If some friends went to prison, you stuck by them. If some enemies broke in and seized your goods, you let them go with a smile, knowing they couldn't touch your real treasure. Nothing they did bothered you. Nothing set you back. So don't throw it all away now. You were sure of yourselves then. It's still a sure thing. But you need to stick it out, staying with God's plan, so you'll be there for the promised completion. It won't be long now. He's on the way. He'll show up most any minute. But anyone who is right with me thrives on loyal trust. If he cuts and runs, I won't be very happy. But we're not quitters who lose out. Oh no, we'll stay with it and survive, trusting all the way. All right, that leads into Hebrews 11, chapter 1. What is it that we are to glean from this as we move into this best known part of Hebrews? First of all, in recognizing that the writer is encouraging his readers to persevere through faith, he spends time, first of all, talking about why perseverance is necessary. That's early on when he talks about being able to walk right up to God into the holy place, that the body of Christ is indeed the curtain, the veil, and we have been able to pierce the veil because Christ made it possible for us to do so. And then he talks about how this faith should be practiced, and that's where we ended pretty much last time, talking about the fact that we need to be inventive in how we encourage love for one another, and we need to not avoid worshiping together. Now, when he says don't avoid worshiping together, it's not done as a rule. That's the way we use it. Do not forsake the assembling of the saints of God together. We say that like it's a rule. This is why you need to come to church, because Hebrews 10 and 25 says that we should not forsake the assembling of the saints of God together. No, he's not using it as a rule. He's expressing what he has witnessed and what has been shared with him, which is to escape persecution, believers were staying away from corporate worship. To escape being wrapped up with others who might get caught in a corporate worship experience, they decided to stay away. And so he's saying, don't be afraid to gather, knowing that it is entirely possible that in gathering you will suffer. You should gather anyway, because your devotion to Christ should exceed your devotion to anything else in this life. Now, as I say that, I'm moving on, but as I say that, I know how difficult that is for most of us to embrace and to agree with. We practice a convenient religion. We do the things that we do as long as it is convenient for us to do so. Where convenience is lost, we tend to start doing other things. And what the writer of Hebrews is saying to his readers and saying to us is that Jesus and our commitment to Christ ought to be greater than our personal convenience. Now, I would hope that every Christian can agree with that we do not worship Christ so long as it is convenient for us to do so. We worship Christ because Christ is worthy of our worship and of our praise. We worship Christ with the full understanding that there is risk involved in worshiping him. Now, for you and I, at least in 2022, as of this moment, don't know what tomorrow's going to bring, it's not a crime to gather for the public worship of Christ, at least not in the United States of America. I'm sure it is in other places in the world. It's not a crime. So we're not running the risk of law enforcement being on the outside of the doors with handcuffs ready to take us to jail because we worship Christ. That's not the risk that we run. We run a different kind of risk, and to my way of thinking, we run a more personal risk. We run the risk of actually being transformed. And some of us don't want to be transformed. This is what I was talking about Sunday. I was preaching from John Sunday. For those who are unfamiliar, we preached from John Sunday, and we talked about our need for transformation and what transformation looks like, and that for many of us, transformation is not necessarily something that we want, because Transformation demands that we move. Transformation is a process. It is not an event. I say this about many things having to do with the Christian life. Salvation is not an event. It is a process. In the same way, transformation, by its very nature, involves a process, not an event. And the process is we are constantly in the pursuit of becoming what God would have us to be. You ain't there yet. Don't get mad. I ain't there yet either. I don't know anybody who is there yet. But all of us ought to be on the road toward becoming. Becoming what? Becoming more what Christ told us we should be. What is it that Christ told us we should be? More loving, more forgiving, more ministry-minded. Love without limit and without restriction. Forgiving of those who hurt you, no matter how many times they hurt you. And keeping them in the same place that they were in before they hurt you. And putting the needs of others ahead of your own wants. Giving to those who are hungry, giving to those who don't have, whether what they don't have is food or shelter or clothing, whatever it is that they need, doing what you can to make provision for them. None of that is easy. And most of it demands, all of it demands that we stop being who we were in order to become who Christ would have us to be. It doesn't just mean that we stop being who we were. In many cases, it means that we have to unlearn what we were taught by people who mean a great deal to us. All of us were raised with and it doesn't matter whether it was a parent or a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle or a teacher or a church person. Somebody had a mentor in their lives that helped shape the foundation of their belief system. Well, can I tell you, without knowing who the person was and without knowing what they taught you, they probably taught you wrong. They probably taught you wrong. Because they taught you how to be limiting in certain areas that Christ says we are not to be limited in. Don't love that person. Don't be seen with that person. Don't do too much with that person. Don't spend too much time with that person. Don't ever give anybody an opportunity to take advantage of you. Have you read the parable that Jesus gives of the prodigal son, the lost son? And I say all the time, it should not be the lost son. It should be the lost sons, plural. Because Jesus says there were two sons. And if you read the whole story, both sons were lost. The only difference is how they were lost. One got lost going away from home, and one stayed lost while he was at home. But they were both lost. One wanted all his stuff so that he could go and live the way that he wanted to live. And then when he lost all his stuff, he came back home and he was recalcitrant and he was humbled by his experience and he recognized that he had to make a change in his life. But he wasn't expecting what the father does for him. He says, let me stay somewhere on the estate like one of your hired servants. And the father says, this son of mine who was dead is now alive. Now think about that, because that's what got to the older brother. That's what irritated the older brother. Because when the older brother comes home and he finds out that the younger brother was not just home, but was embraced by the father, to the point that the father was throwing a party for the boy who had come home, he gets mad. He pouts. And I've said this many times before. He doesn't just go home and pout. He doesn't go to his room and pout. He sits out in front of where the party is and pouts. Because you know people like this, right? Who when they pout, they want everybody to know that they're pouting. And so they put themselves in a position where everybody has to pass by them while they're pouting, and they're just waiting on somebody to ask, what's wrong with you? Have you ever asked somebody what's wrong with you and then just stood back and just watched the floodgates open up? Because they can talk for an hour about what's wrong with them. The son said, I never left. I was always here. I always did what you wanted me to do. And yet here this boy comes home and he has wasted all your stuff. He's thrown all your money away, and you treat him like this. You bring him back in. And the father says, everything I have is yours, but this is my child too. And I had to do this because this is my child. That's what Christianity is. And I can guarantee you, you weren't taught that. You heard it in Sunday school. Perhaps you heard the preacher preach about it, but I know you weren't taught it because it goes against our nature. You know what y'all were taught? Forgive, but don't ever forget. Don't ever give them an opportunity to hurt you like that again. If you can't say amen, just say ouch, because I know there's some things I know I'm right about. Anybody see my sister and ask her if she had the right to be wrong? I know I'm right about it because that's our human nature. Because human nature is designed for us to protect ourselves from any further hurt. But Christianity calls for us to do something different. It calls for us to recognize that in our relationship with Christ, what Christ wants is more important than what we want. And what Christ wants for us is to be loving and to be forgiving and to serve the needs of others. I could stay there, but that's not really what I want to do. I'm trying to build up to 11:1. He's talking about the need to recognize what faith should call for. Then in verses 32 through the end of chapter 10, he reminds them of what their faith has already brought them through. But I want you to hear how he says it. Allow me to read that portion to you again. Remember those early days after you first saw the light. Those were the hard times. Kicked around in public, targets of every kind of abuse. Some days it was you, other days your friends. If some friends went to prison, you stuck by them. If some enemies broke in and seized your goods, you let them go with a smile, knowing they couldn't touch your real treasure. Nothing they did bothered you, nothing set you back. What he's describing is what is for most of us the zeal of our new conversion, the zeal of our regeneration. I would imagine that most of us can remember just how zealous we were for the Lord when we first came to know him. Everything was about the Lord. What is it that we preachers say? I looked at my hands and they looked new. I looked at my feet and they did too. He put clapping in my hands and running in my feet and praise on my tongue. All of that happens when it's new. But you know what happens with our faith walk? What happens with our faith walk is the same thing that happens with everything else. It doesn't stay new forever. And the longer we go on with it, the new starts to rub off. You ever get a new car? Can't nobody eat in your new car? Can't nobody drink nothing in your new car? You park 10 miles away from wherever you're going because you don't want nobody to park next to you that might scratch your new car. You drive under the speed limit in your new car. You wash your new car every other day, whether you take it to the car wash or you do it yourself. You take care of that car like it's the most precious, wonderful thing in the world. And then when it finally gets a scratch on it, you fall to your knees. Oh, no. You're all upset because a scratch got on the car. And little by little, the new starts to wear. And then it's not just a scratch, but it's a scratch and a ding. So somebody opened a door close to yours, and they put a little ding in the car. And then you start to think, well, it's okay if I eat a little something in the car. And before you know it, the car has lost all of it. The new smell is gone. You know how a car smells when it's brand new? It has this aroma that you just love that smell. And then the smell goes away. And when the smell goes away and a scratch gets on it and a ding gets on it, and then you decide, well, it's okay to eat a little something in the car. It's okay to drink. And then you spill something on the car, or you stain the seats, or something gets ripped in the car. And the new wears off. And before you know it, and you don't know how it happened, when it happened, where it happened, before you know it, you just start treating the car like a car. Stop taking it to get the oil changed. Next thing you know, the car ain't running. Sitting on the side of the road somewhere. And somebody asks you what happened to the car. I don't know what happened to the car. Very much like what happens with our Christian walk. There's a newness to it. There's a zeal to it. There is a desire to do everything we can to live like Christ. And as long as the new is on it, we come into church every Sunday, sometimes twice on Sunday. Sometimes you'll come at 8 and you'll stay till 11. And you'll go to Sunday school in between, because I love the Lord. And you give your tithe and your offering without anybody having to ask you about it or anything like that. And you volunteer for ministries. What ministry do you want to serve? I want to serve on all of them. You put your name down and you serve on all of them. And then the new starts to wear off. And a Sunday comes when you want to watch the saints instead of come to church. Well, the Lord will understand. Or a Sunday comes after you were out all night Saturday night. I ain't quite there yet to get up and come to church this morning. The Lord will understand. I signed up for all these ministries. I didn't know I had to go to all these meetings if I signed up for all these ministries. And they don't do nothing in the meetings, no how. I don't know why we got to go to the meeting. Well, why I got to listen to the minutes from the last meeting if I was in the last meeting? And how come I got to listen to all this motion and singing? And Sister so-and-so always asks the same 3 questions. Y'all know what I'm talking about, right? And the new starts to wear off. How many times do I have to give so-and-so $2? Because he's always standing at the church. Somebody ought to move him from the church door. He shouldn't be standing at the church door every time I walk in asking me for $2. Why Reb talking about that today? Who told him what's going on? I don't know why y'all think the sermons are always directed right at you. The Lord didn't reveal to me. Now look, you say so-and-so because Sister Carol did this, and you need to tell her not to do that no more. And then Sister Carol gets mad at me because I done said something that's walking down her street and turned and knocked on her door. Thank you, Sister Carol. Don't get mad at me for doing that. And the new starts to wear off. More seriously, you start thinking about the things that are going on in your life, and you start to ask yourself, even if you don't ask anybody else, you start asking yourself, well, why am I still dealing with this? if I gave my life to the Lord? I shouldn't have these problems. I shouldn't have children problems. I shouldn't have marriage problems. I shouldn't have job problems. I shouldn't have money problems because I gave my life to the Lord. I sure shouldn't have health problems because I gave my life to the Lord. The new starts to wear off. That's what he's describing here. When he says, remember those days when you first saw the light? He said people mistreated you, and it was okay because you knew that it wasn't about them. It was about the Lord. He said some of your friends went to jail, but you stood by them because you knew it wasn't about them. It was about the Lord. He said people stole from you, and you said go ahead and keep it because it wasn't about what they stole. It was about the Lord. He said nobody could touch what you really had in the Lord. He said, do you remember what that was like? And the reason why he has to call them to remembrance is because it had left them. Now don't get mad at them because it leaves all of us. All of us at some point or another get frustrated with. Can we be real for a second? You've never shaken an angry fist at God? Never? You've always been in agreement with everything that the Lord has allowed to happen in your life? Thank you, Reverend, for at least saying it out loud. No. You've never had reason to question what God was doing? All of us have. When I would do good and evil is present on every hand, when I have every intention of not doing something and I end up doing it, when I have every intention of doing something and I end up not doing it, when I treat everybody right and nobody treats me right. Not folk outside the church, not folk within the church, not the pastor, not the deacon ministry. Nobody treats me right. You've never had a reason to question? I brought my baby to be dedicated to the Lord when the baby was 3 months old. The baby was baptized when 6 years old. Now the baby's running the streets doing all kinds of crazy stuff. I gave the baby to the Lord. And this is what the Lord is allowing my baby to do? Nobody's ever had that question. Nobody's ever had that doubt. He's calling them to remembrance because all of us have reached a place in our walk with God where we are frustrated and angry with what God has allowed. And understand, I know we like to talk about the devil, and I believe that there is a devil, and I believe that there is a hell. But I believe that God is in charge of everything. And so even when trouble comes, I have to say that God somehow allows the trouble to come. And I sometimes get mad with God about it. I think I'm in good company. Jeremiah told the Lord, I ain't preaching no more. I've been doing this for years, for generations. And all it's gotten me is trouble. People have tried to kill me. People have rejected me. People have laughed at me. People have ridiculed me. All it's gotten me is trouble. I'm going home, and I ain't going to do this no more. And he said before he could get home, it was like fire shut up in his bones, and he felt like he had to do it. Jonah. God told Jonah to go one way. Jonah said, no, I ain't going that way. In fact, I'm going to go the exact opposite way. And God sent a fish, sent a storm and a fish to find Jonah. The folk on the boat didn't want to put Jonah in the water. Jonah said, if you don't put me in the water, God's going to put the boat in the water. Y'all better go ahead and put me in the water. And for 3 days, Scripture says Jonah was in the belly of a fish. And when God did cause the fish to spit Jonah up, you know where Jonah was? Right where God told him to go in the first place. So I think I'm in good company. I get frustrated sometimes with God. And sometimes I have to remember. I had a professor in seminary, theology professor by the name of Fisher Humphreys, who I think of all the professors that I had the most profound impact on my life. He taught systematic theology, and I went to his class, first day of class, and he made a statement in the class that irritated everybody in the class. He said, "Sometimes I question the love of God." Opening statement for the class. Sometimes I question the love of God. Now, most of the students were expecting him to come immediately behind that and refute what he had just said. He didn't do that. He went on to talk about why he questions the love of God. He talked about pestilence. He talked about violence. He talked about hunger. He talked about abuse of children. He talked about all of the ills that were taking place in the world. And this is 1983. And he's talking about all of the terrible ills that were going on in the world at that time. And he would come back after every paragraph, and he wasn't reading it. It was in his head. At the end of every paragraph, he'd say, "Sometimes I question the love of God." By now, the students got angry. They were frustrated, and they started throwing up their hands because they wanted to refute what he was saying, and they started talking about this. How can you say that? How could you feel that way? And you're a professor. You're a theology professor. How could you possibly say that with such definitiveness, with such boldness? How could you possibly say that? And he kept right on. And this went on for about 15 minutes. It seemed like it went on for an hour and a half. It went on for about 15 minutes. And finally, they stopped throwing up hands, and they just started talking back to him. They got so angry. They lost all decorum of the classroom. "You're a heretic. You don't need to be teaching on this campus." Blah, 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 blah. And he politely, he never raised his voice for anything. Never raised his voice. He said, "Well, since you all seem to know everything, then you don't need me to teach you. So I'm going to go back to my office." And he picked up his stuff, put it in his attaché case, and walked out. Didn't come back. And all the students in there were raving and ranting, and many of them said, "I'm dropping this class. I ain't gonna take this class. I don't need to learn anything. There's nothing this man can teach me." So the next day when he came back, class was only about half as full as it was the first day. And he walked in, and we had prayer, and he smiled, and he said, "Now we can begin to teach." His point was, I need to get rid of all y'all, because all y'all have these preconceived notions about what it means to be a follower of Christ. And if you have followed Christ so blindly that you have never, ever once questioned the love of God, then I can't do nothing with you. And so finally, he ended that portion of what he was talking about by saying, as I was saying on yesterday, sometimes I question the love of God. But when I think about Calvary, and when I think about the suffering that he did for my sin, when I think about the fact that he who knew no sin became sin for me, when I think about the fact that he died and was buried and was raised on the third day not for him, but for me, then that settles all of my doubts and my questions. And I fell in love with Fisher Humphreys from that point on. I'm trying to make a point to us. I don't want us to be so holy that we act like we don't ever get mad with God. I don't want us to be so righteous that we never question what God permits. And we acknowledge the fact that it's God who permits it. I know we're autonomous beings. We all do what we do. God permits us to be autonomous beings. God made us to be autonomous beings. And so if God made us to be autonomous beings, then ultimately what we do is under the permissive will of God. Sickness is under the permissive will of God. Violence and war is under the permissive will of God. Pestilence is under the permissive will of God. There is nothing that happens in this world, yea, in this universe, that is not under the permissive will of God. And I'm not going to lie and say that I always like or appreciate or agree with what God allows. But God ain't never asked for my permission. I have yet to be in a moment of prayer when I heard the voice of God saying, now look, Jeff, you all right with what's going on? Now look, son, I'm going to let a few more of these things happen, and I want you to be okay. I ain't never had that experience. I've had a whole lot of experiences in prayer. I ain't never had God ask me what I thought about anything. My faith rests in the fact that God is in control. My faith rests in the fact that all things work together for the good to them who love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. My faith rests in the fact that I am his and he is mine, and no matter what happens on this side of the Jordan River, I am secure in the knowledge that I will spend eternity with him. And so I can say, like Job, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. I can say that I will stand with Christ no matter what, because that's what my faith calls on me to do. There is nothing that can happen that will cause me to move away. Understand, God doesn't move away from us, but we can move away from him. And I refuse to let anything, check the record of my life, and there's some ugly stuff in there. I refuse to let anything cause me to move away from Christ. Now, that is the lead-in to what he says in chapter 11, okay? 40 minutes in, and I'm just not getting to chapter 11. But all of that leads into what he says in chapter 11. Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. He ended chapter 10 by calling them back to that faith relationship with God that allowed us to endure anything, knowing that God was in control, and he called it a persevering faith. And so as he moves into chapter 11, he's saying the faith must continue. It is being certain. Y'all like the King James Version. Our faith is the substance of things hoped for. But I like what Peterson says. It's being certain of what we hope for. It is having absolute confidence in what was promised, because I have absolute confidence in the one who promised it. How can you persevere? How can you stay the course? How can you continue to serve a God that allows these terrible things to happen in your life? We remind you, this was written during a time when these Christians were under double persecution. Persecution from the Roman Empire, persecution from Jewish orthodoxy. And I can see someone asking the question, how can you stay the course when you're enduring persecution on two hands and dealing with all kinds of trial and tribulation? How can you possibly stay the course? Now faith is being certain of what we hope for. Where does your certainty come from? It's not in just what was said. It was in who said it. I've told you this before, so forgive me for repeating myself. I find that as I do this long and long, I repeat myself more and more. I was raised in a house not just with two parents, but with three. My mother, my father, and my father's mother, my grandmother, all lived in the same house. So there was rarely a time when there wasn't an adult, there wasn't an authority figure in the house. But on those rare occasions when my mother, my father, and my grandmother were out of the house, my elder, because I ain't got but one older brother, my older brother was left in charge. And my parents told my sister and I that we were to respect my older brother and everything he said, just like it was one of them who said it. And we said, yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. And they went on out the door. And once they went on out the door, we did whatever we wanted to do. And my brother could have said anything in the world, and it wouldn't have mattered. And 99 times out of 100, he said only those things that my parents or my grandmother would have said. But it didn't matter, because we had no respect for the one who was saying it. It's not in what was said. It was in who said it. Does that make sense to you? Now faith is being certain of what we hope for and sure of what we do not see. Where does that certainty come from? It comes not just from what was said, but who said it. I'm not always confident about loving your enemies and blessing those who curse you. I'm not always good with doing good to those who hate me and praying for them who use me and persecute me. I'm not always good with that. But I'm trying every day. Not because I like what was said, but I respect the one who said it. I'm not always good with turning the other cheek. I'm not always good with going the second mile. I'm not always good with making myself last. But there is one who said, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. So while I might not be good with what was said, I have the utmost confidence in the one who said it. Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see, because I know where it came from. And I'm able to do it with certainty because God is the one who said it. The Syriac version of this verse reads this way: faith is the certainty of our hope, the subsistence of them, and what gives them an existence. So with respect to faith and hope, the incarnation and suffering of Christ is where our hope rests. It rests in his person. My brother could say anything he wanted, and my sister and I would do whatever we wanted to do until it got close time for mom and daddy to come home. And then all of a sudden, his authority took on new meaning because we didn't want him to tell mama and daddy what we had been doing. I live under the authority of Christ. Living under the authority of Christ does not mean that I like everything that Christ does. It does not mean that I don't have questions. It simply means that I acknowledge that he is the central authority of my life. He sits on the throne of my heart, and I can't do anything well without him. I've been doing stuff for a long time, and some stuff you think after you've been doing it so long, you can just do it. I can't do nothing without Christ. And the older I get, the more I realize how little I can do without him. I used to have the audacious belief that I woke myself up in the morning. I just decided I wanted to get up. Until there were times when I couldn't get up. And it helped to remind me that I can't do nothing without the Lord. I make a living with my mouth. I make a living talking. This is what I do. And I actually thought I was pretty good at talking till I tried to talk without talking to the Lord first. You want to see a mess? I got it on film. Y'all know, y'all remember video, VHS? I got VHS video of me trying to talk without talking to the Lord. It's scary stuff. I can't do nothing without God. Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. When he says certain of what we do not see, he's not talking about, see, prosperity folk use that to talk about your house and your car and your 401k and your Powerball number. I know somebody's going to go play the Powerball tonight. God bless you. That's what they mean. But when he says being certain of what you do not see, he's talking about God. You don't see God with your physical eye. You don't hear God audibly with your physical ear. When he says certain of what you do not see, he's talking about God. And what he's saying is, even though I don't see him, even though I don't hear him with my physical ear, even though I can't reach out and touch him with my physical hand, I am absolutely confident that he is there. And not just there, he's in charge. He's in control. I'm certain of it. Absolutely certain of it. And I'm certain of how big a mess my life would be if he weren't in control. And so I keep my faith in him. Now, the rest of 11 talks about why we should trust in God. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. That speaks to the creative power of God. By an act of faith, verse 4, Abel brought a better sacrifice to God than Cain. Now he gets into ancient Hebrew scripture and history. But the key thing for me is not God's creative power of the universe. The key thing for me is not what God did for Abel, and he talks about Abraham, and he talks about David, and he talks about Enoch. None of that is key for me. What's key for me is that I know what he's done for me. I preach every Sunday about what God has done in the lives of other people. And that's what I'm supposed to do. We preach scripture. But I try not to ever end without coming back and saying, I know what he's also done for me. I know what he did for my grandparents. I didn't know my grandfather, but I heard my father talk about being raised in a sharecropper's shack in St. Francisville, Louisiana, where he could count the stars through the cracks in the ceiling, and he could count the blades of grass through the cracks on the floor. He had a way of putting that thing, and he talked about how the Lord took care of his father and his mother and brought them from St. Francisville down here to Baton Rouge and took care of them and helped them to raise a family with a limited education, but they kept their hand in God's hand. And I know those. So even though I didn't know my grandfather, I know the stories just like I knew him. But I don't stand on what God did for my grandfather. I knew my grandmother, and I heard her stories too, but I don't stand on what God did for my grandmother. I don't stand on what God did for my daddy and for my mama, as much as I love both of them. I don't stand on what the Lord did for my brother and my sister, as much as I love both of them. I got my own story. I know what he's done for me. And it's what he's done for me that causes me to be certain of what I do not see. I got 5 minutes. Skip over. I got a whole lot of stuff here. I want you to skip all of that stuff and go to the end of chapter 11, starting with verse 32. I could go on and on, but I've run out of time. There are so many more. Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, the prophets. Through acts of faith, they toppled kingdoms, made justice work, took the promises for themselves. They were protected from lions, fires, and sword thrusts, turned disadvantage to advantage, won battles, routed alien armies. Women received their loved ones back from the dead. There were those who under torture refused to give in and go free, preferring something better, resurrection. Others braved abuse and whips and, yes, chains and dungeons. We have stories of those who were stoned, sawed in two, murdered in cold blood. Stories of vagrants wandering the earth in animal skins, homeless, friendless, powerless. The world didn't deserve them, making their way as best they could on the cruel edges of the world. Not one of these people, even though their lives of faith were exemplary, got their hands on what was promised. God had a better plan for us, that their faith and our faith would come together to make one completed whole. Their lives of faith not complete apart from ours. Keep reading into chapter 12. Do you see what all this means? All these pioneers who blazed the way, all these veterans cheering us on. It means we'd better get on with it. Strip down, start running, and never quit. No extra spiritual fat, no parasitic sins. Keep your eyes on Jesus, who both began and finished the race we're in. Study how he did it, because he never lost sight of where he was headed, that exhilarating finish in and with God. He could put up with anything along the way, cross, shame, whatever. And now he's there in the place of honor, right alongside God. When you find yourselves flagging in your faith, go over that story again. Go over that story again. Item by item, that long litany of hostility he plowed through, that will shoot adrenaline into your souls. I'm out of time. Let me say this. Don't leave out what he says there. He talks about all the pioneers and all that they endured, and perhaps I'll come back and cover that a little bit more next week. But don't leave out the part where he says, when you find yourselves flagging in your faith, go over that story again. The writer of Hebrews is very careful not to say, review your story again. He says, remember that story. Your story is helpful, but your story don't save. Your story doesn't have saving power. Your story doesn't have forgiving power. Your story is what you're familiar with. It's what you've gone through. And you can tell it with all kinds of enthusiasm because it's your story. But your story doesn't save. Only his story saves. There was a time in this church, and I'm sure for most of us of a certain age, there was a time when we had testifying meeting. Speaking meeting is what they called it here. And folk would come up and they would give their testimony, and some of them would just say the same thing. Pastor, officers, and members, I stand before you to let you know what my determination is, and my determination is to make heaven my home. I have no other. Pray for me, not that I get saved, but that I hold on and prove faithful all the way to the end. That's what most of them did. But every now and then somebody